So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and we make a return to a map that we've seen a few times at this point. It's turned into one of those that makes a semi-regular appearance on the channel. I can't actually remember what this map exactly is called in the game files, but very often we refer to it as a Haradrim settlement because of the rather arid surroundings and the architecture type that was used from Standard Medieval 2, although I think I may need to try and be a little bit more creative in term for the settlement that is actually being utilised here, purely because it is going to be a good versus evil siege, and good is on the defence this time around. It's a rather interesting layout for a siege battle as well, in the sense that everything is rather front-loaded. There's quite a lot of settlement in behind, but generally speaking, once the attackers get through the initial choke points, they tend to just be able to sweep through there without any resistance, purely because the best and most obvious choice for a final stand is right up here at the front, on the highest ground around the main keep. So it's a little bit different in that regard, the big gorge that separates the attackers and defenders right from the off as well. But yeah, going to be an interesting one this, rather a large and sprawling map as well. And like I said, good versus evil siege with evil on the attack, so you know what that means. It's going to be a very numerous attack, and the forces of good are going to have to choose their positions right if they are to be victorious here, make good use of their range support as well, to deal with the overwhelming numbers that they're going to be facing. Starting off then, we have Rhudaur, played by T.S. Niehoff, and again, this is a very good attacking faction, not only because of the numbers that I've already mentioned. Rhudaur can certainly engage in numbers-based warfare in a situation like this, but it's mainly for their supporting units. Their throwing projectiles are so strong, and the damage dealing potential they have is so quick that very often the defenders can struggle under the weight of Rhudaur's assaults. Now, this does come with the slight downside that Rhudaur's units tend to be, individually speaking, a little bit more fragile, though the Rhudaur clansmen here are maybe not the best example of that, purely because they do have a good shield value for mitigating arrow fire from the front, and with the armour upgrade as you see here, they are actually decently tanky. A very good all-round unit this, especially in a situation like this where you need to be able to outlast really the defenders with their quality, utilising your numbers. Dunman Pikemen, however, very much represent some of the fragilities that Rhudaur have on display. Very light armour, no shields of course, prime targets for enemy archers, because you can't really allow pikes, even ones as cheap as this, to have their way with the front line. So yeah, Dunman Pikemen, very weak to those things that all pikes are weak to. Low stats as well, so if their formation is compromised, they're in trouble. Witch Realm Enslavers add some armour-piercing punch to the front line as well, some high-tier armour-piercing punch, that is. Rhudaur have got plenty of regular units that can engage in armour piercing, but few of them, in fact none of them really, are of the same level of quality as the Witch Realm Enslavers. We also have a couple of units here of the Ettenmoor's Troll Hunters, decent armour for what they are. Obviously the Javelins are the main event here though, with their supporting punch as well. Very nice armour piercing damage. A Catapult is an interesting choice for Rhudaur. I would have thought that it would have been better off investing even more into your throwing projectiles and allowing one of your fellows on the attack to bring a little bit more in the way of artillery, but I guess ultimately it doesn't matter. Artillery is always going to be a little bit of a gamble regardless of who brings it, and if it pays off for the attackers, very often it's the sort of thing which can render the battle unwinnable for defenders in a situation like this, so put some pressure on in that regard. I'm sure there are Arthedain Rangers and Trollshaw Axe Throwers and Black Wolves around here as well, because this is a very small looking army, but Rhudaur have got plenty of units that can hide, most of them those supporting units that I mentioned. More Rhudaur clansmen. And a single unit of Dunman Hunters here, so not a huge amount of long-range projectiles by the looks of things. Yes, there are probably rangers, but they're not really designed for shooting back and forth with their body piercing, as it still is in this version of the game. Dunman Hunters, on the other hand, are very low tier, and skirmishing is really the only thing they're truly good for, and even then it's not really dealing damage, but making the enemy use up their own ammunition. Then we have Y2K86 playing as Angmar, very much a different sort of mindset here. Angmar do still have some very dangerous supporting units in terms of close range ranged units, but their infantry is very different. Their infantry is very much focused around survivability, heavy armour, and the upgraded Witch Realm Pikemen. While they do have the same weaknesses ultimately as the Dunman Pikemen we've already seen, the much heavier armour they wield or wear, as well as the better stats that they do wield, that's going to be the sort of thing which makes them have far more longevity, even in situations which maybe are not too beneficial to pikes. Got some Gundabad Guard back here as well. For the cost, they're not too much, and ultimately they are a very good, solid, defensive kind of unit. However, the Spear Malice does mean they're not going to be the best at dealing damage. Fortunately, however, just in behind, Upgraded Guardians of Cardolan can certainly fill the void of regular line infantry units. Very, very good defensively, in fact probably better defensively than many of the other units on this kind of tier. So if you think about stuff like the Dismounted Serpent Guard or the Uruk-hai Infantry even, those are different kinds of units, but the same kind of unit, but the Guardians of Cardolan, the most defensive really of the evil factions units of this type, which does mean that they don't do quite as much damage, but Angmar are more designed for being aggressive and then subsequently outlasting their foes. They do have a few units which are very capable of dealing damage very, very quickly though. The Witches here, ever the controversial unit. I'd say just as often, if not more often, we see the Witches actually focused down successfully by defenders. So the defenders are very much going to have to be on the lookout for the Witches here if they intend to not get fried in green fire. Blackwatch Legion with their mass pushing capabilities, we've seen this sort of tactic also be used to devastating effect, again somewhat controversially though less so than the Witches. The Blackwatch Legion are stronger than the equivalent Mordor unit, which we may see later on, but are obviously a smaller unit as well. Witcher and Blackguard, the more defensive of Angmar's two regular bodyguard units, but in a situation like this where you're looking to outlast the enemy and other factions can take up the slack of being more damage focused, I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. And then we also have some Trolls of Gundabad and some Trolls of Angmar, so both units of heavier Trolls being used here. If they're used at the same time and in the right way, they can do a lot of damage very, very quickly to the defenders, and again, they don't have limitless manpower by any means here. Moving on, we have the Misty Mountains, played by Ricky Beagle. Misty Mountains obviously the most numbers-focused faction in the game, other than arguably Dunland, but then they're a little bit of a weird one as it stands in this current world where the new patch has not yet released. Goblin King's Bodyguard. Again, we've seen the Witcher and Blackguard already individually stronger, though, as we have noted in the past, the Goblin King's Bodyguard can be surprisingly effective because of the slightly larger unit size and the fact that each of these goblins does have an extra hit point to play with. Regular heavy goblin infantry, however, look fairly similar, but are at the complete opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to quality. They are individually probably the worst unit in class. The fact that they are so numerous is a bit of a saving grace for them, but morale is always a constant issue, and in terms of damage dealing capabilities, yes, they don't have a spear malice to contend with, but that's about the nicest thing you can say about them. Numbers really are the key to everything they do. And most of the time as well, heavy goblin spears tend to be the better option because they are more capable of taking punishment, and the armour piercing does help offset the spear malice and then some. So generally speaking, you're better off going for the heavy goblin spears unless you know you're going up against a lighter faction like Harad or Linden. But on this occasion there will certainly be some armoured factions on the defence, so the spears are definitely a better choice. White Uruk Fearmongers are a higher tier unit of halberdiers, fairly expensive among the Misty Mountains roster, but because of the lower tier units that you do tend to build your army around, you can certainly afford to splash the cash in a few areas, and the White Uruk Fearmongers in a siege like this often is one such way of doing so. Spears, crossbows, again the defenders, if they allow crossbows to get in position and start hammering away on them, it's not going to end too well for them, you would suggest, so we'll see. Cave Trolls, similar to the Trolls we've already seen, timing is going to be very, very key. A couple of units of the Cave Trolls as well on either side of the Misty Mountains army. Better at punching through lines with their denser formation, but this also makes them more vulnerable to enemy units when they get into melee, and they are individually weaker anyway. Interesting choice for the General's unit as well. Generally speaking, I prefer to see the General in the Goblin King's Bodyguard rather than the Blackbacks, because it allows you to use the Blackbacks a little bit more freely without fear of losing your General early, and also the Blackbacks have their ability to hide taken away by the General being in their unit. So that's something else, which means that if you want to try and get them to hide, maybe to avoid arrow fire, you won't be able to do that now, but we'll see. Mountain Uruk Host are another unit of slightly upper end line infantry units, kind of similar in terms of tier to the Guardians of Cardoon, though more well rounded. They're not going to be quite as solid defensively, but they do have better facilities for dealing damage. Drake Broodlings are another unit which, when it comes to mass pushing, albeit in a slightly more battering ram-esque way, the Drake Broodlings, once they get going, can be incredibly difficult to stop, but if you do stop them, they can be relatively underwhelming in terms of their abilities in straight melee. And then some Black Uruks as well, the Heavy Swordsman. Very well-rounded unit, as we have seen several times in the past. Now then, we move on to another Misty Mountains army, actually under the command of Seraphim. And we have got yet another unit of Blackback Mountain Berserkers, some Heavy Goblin Archers as well. That's one thing I would say is largely missing so far, which is not too surprising given Rhudaur, Angmar and Misty. None of them are particularly good archer factions, but having very limited long-range skirmishing capabilities will allow the defenders to use their ammunition as they see fit a little bit more, perhaps. Maybe a little bit concerning for the attackers. Drake Broodlings are here. Upgraded Goblin Infantry, which, I mean, it makes them tougher, but they're still very, very easy to kill for any sort of professional soldier. We have got some Black Orcs of the Mountains here as well in slightly larger numbers. We've got more crossbows in there. More of a presence from the standard heavy Goblin Halberdiers, which are cheaper and still offer that armour-piercing phalanx, though morale and stats and just, you know, general weaknesses are going to make them less effective than the White Orcs that we see over there. Infantry and spears, as we've seen already. Goblin King's Bodyguard. He's also gone for the Snow Trolls rather than 2 units of Cave Trolls, individually stronger and also significantly faster, so on the open field they can be very good at catching things, but in a siege that is often more of an incidental strength that they have. And then last, but by no means least, we have another Rhudaur army under the command of Medexa, a couple of units of Coldfell Maidens, which can be used for hunting down enemy cavalry that decides to sally out, or can simply be used as regular javelins. It's one of the reasons why I like javelin cavalry when you're on the attack in a situation like this, even if single HP cavalry, even here, has very clear weaknesses, in my opinion. We've got a few units of Dunman Spearmen to help pad out the army. Again, numbers going to be no issue really for the attackers, certainly not early on. Whether or not the quality of their armies will be up to snuff remains to be seen. Rhudaur Clansmen as well, a couple of units of those Dunman Pikemen we've seen already. Several units of standard Rhudaur Swordsmen, which are better certainly than stuff like the goblins, the heavy Goblin Infantry that we've seen, but they're still going to struggle a little bit, you'd suggest, against quality defenders. And then we've got more Ettenmoor's Troll Hunters, and here we have the Arthedain Berserkers, which are not as strong in straight melee as the Witch-Realm Enslavers we saw earlier, but they do have throwing axes to make them a little bit more of a multifaceted unit. Now then, moving on to the defenders, we've got 2 armies over here in the centre of things, starting off with Diego Rio Ramos playing as the Hobbits / the Shire. 3 units of Proudfoot Protectors, which I'm a fan of that, because you can go into the red limit as the Hobbits relatively easily without sacrificing too much. And the Proudfoots, pikes in melee, crossbows at range, exactly the kind of unit which on the defence like this can be extremely devastating. Especially when you consider, like I said, there's not a huge amount by the looks of things of counter-skirmishing that the attacks are going to be able to engage in. So they're going to be able to use these crossbows more freely than perhaps they would have been thinking, even with the attackers being what they are. Battling Brandybucks are here, armour piercing. Pretty much every Hobbit infantry unit has got armour piercing to some extent. Individually their stats are not particularly high, and generally speaking the quality isn't really there for most of them. But the armour piercing will be useful against the Orcs and the Goblins among the attackers today, less so against Rhudaur, it must be said. We've got the Ents over here, which pretty much are the good forces version of Trolls. Of course in the lore that is very much the other way around, Trolls are the counterfeits, but the Ents, for defenders, the timing can be a little bit iffy on them. There may never be a good moment to use the Ents really, and it could just be a panic button to push when your line starts to falter a little bit. The Bjornings represent fast movers, which are kind of monstrous cavalry like berserkers on horseback. Useful. Once their hit points are gone, their defensive values are a little bit suspect, but again, when you're the Hobbits, spending a little bit extra money on a unit which is a little bit eccentric like that is not the end of the world. And Banderbrass Archers are hidden, and much of the Hobbit roster can hide as well. Bandits, Dunedain Rangers are probably hidden amongst here as well. Hobbitry in arms, yeah, all of the usual suspects. Now then, we have Nuclear Destroyer, who's going to be playing as Cardolan, so the Arnorians going to the aid of the Hobbits here. Cardolan, morale issues aside, are a pretty well-rounded faction. Minhiriath Archers and Spearmen, all of the Minhiriath units are dependable, not really all that exciting, other than, of course, the Sharpshooters here, who not only are macemen in melee, but also crossbows at range, and crossbows are certainly not something the defenders are going to be lacking here between Cardolan and those Proudfoot Protectors from the Shire. We also have some Mercenary Guildsmen for more armour piercing in melee, some very high-end armour piercing in the Tharbad Warhammers as well, pretty much the Cardolan equivalent to the Rhudaur Enslavers we've already seen. But also Dunedain Captains, a little bit of Dunedain finesse does still exist within Cardolan as a kingdom, and the Captains are the best melee offering in that regard. A couple of units of them. We have some Minotaur Roman Gatekeepers. Defensive siege is going to be important. Trebuchet like this although they do need to be a little bit careful of the catapult sniping it out, because that would be a real tragedy. Wardens of Tyr and Gorthad are going to be very, very good at holding a line, higher end pikes, and generally speaking, Cardolan do quite well in that regard, although it must be said they've decided to only go for their high tier pikes. The rest of their roster is made up largely of regular infantry, mercenaries, and of course centred around their crossbows, and the gatekeepers being the strongest of those. And finally, the player who sent me the battle replay is Portaleno over here, playing as Arthedain, so yeah, very much an Arnorian focused faction here. I guess there's a way to spin it that this is a settlement on the Gwathlo. That's a stretch, given that the Gwathlo I don't think is quite this vast, but you can see land on the other side, so maybe it's doable. Arthedain men-at-arms, with the armour upgrade, it does push them slightly ahead of what the Minhiriath men-at-arms from Cardolan offer, and Arthedain don't have quite the same morale issues that Cardolan do, at least not initially. They can still be pressured into routing. Certainly the regular units can without too much of a shove. Some dismounted Knights of Annunnoir, very defensive as a bodyguard unit goes, but not too dissimilar to something like the Witcher Blackguard that we've already seen. We've got some dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights as well. Heavy swordsmen will be useful at carving their way through the numbers heavy attackers. Numinous Gate Guards, very, very similar to the Wardens of Tyr and Gorthad from Cardolan, functionally identical really. Unlike Cardolan though, Arthedain pretty much always will bring their regular pikes as well. Arthedain pikemen here with the armour upgrades as well to make them a little bit more solid. Dunedain Peacekeepers here, again, going for this more aggressive unit is I think the right thing to do because of the numbers heavy nature of the attackers, and Dunedain Peacekeepers will be pretty damn efficient against the rank and file orcs and hillmen that they're going to have to face off against. Arthedain pikemen, and of course the Dunedain, the high tier Dunedain at range for Arthedain are really, really deadly. The rangers, of course, no surprises there. The Troll Slayers with armour piercing punch from their javelins, and then the armour piercing at long range as well from their steel bows from the Wardens of the North. Looks like 2 units of them as well. So the red limit has definitely been gone into here several times by the defenders. Let's see if it pays off. Though first and foremost, we will make a little bit of a cut. I'm sure that there will be a little bit of a grace period involved in this one as the defenders sort themselves out based on the deployment zones. But yeah, I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when the battle is getting underway.
So we rejoin here, and all of these Hobbit units were hidden and now they have revealed themselves. So it's kind of an awkward situation, I suppose, for the Misty Mountains and Rhudaur as they started to move forward, because they couldn't really... They knew that the Hobbits were here because they would have seen all of the Shire's forces bank up in this area, but they can't really open up by using any of their ranged units to start a little bit of a skirmish. They have to move in and start the engagement in earnest because of the nature of the Shire's armies and so many of their units being able to hide anywhere. Now, that might be a blessing in disguise for them because it means they can't really mess around too much, and the Hobbit's more lightweight nature may start to come into play a little bit sooner if you're forced to be aggressive more, but still, it does take away some options off the table here. I'm a little bit surprised as well that the Coldfell Maidens were committed forward so early here, because very, very quickly you can see the combination of arrows and javelins have been utilised, and so far, very, very early days of course, but they won't be too displeased by this. The Misty Mountains and Rhudaur are perhaps a little bit more lightweight than some of the orcs we're going to be seeing on the other side, especially headed up as they are by Angmar, albeit a slightly different Angmar than perhaps we're used to seeing, some Barrow-wights that have since revealed themselves. You can see as well that the defenders have elected to retreat a little bit further. Under normal circumstances on this map we have seen the gorge be used as the first point of defence, but that is not going to be the case this time, so the entirety of the outer layer of the settlement has already been technically conquered, though we've never really seen this lower section of the city used as any sort of meaningful defensive ground for the defenders for reasons I've already mentioned. Doesn't really have the correct terrain for them, it doesn't really make much sense for them to try and hold on down there. Whereas up here you've got some much better choke points, you've got a little bit of elevation that you can use to your advantage as well, though one thing that the defenders so far haven't decided to do is form up a defensive line along this cliffside path, and they will need to do that because the Misty Mountains are sending some goblins and some trolls around here, and so far wide open it would seem. I think there's some Hobbit units waiting, but a single unit of Hobbitry in arms is not going to be the answer when it comes to dealing with such units. Some slightly more solid Cardolan spears coming forward as well. The Minhiriath spears will offer some much needed rigidity on the front line in terms of their defensive values to any of the basic Hobbits that we've already seen. Of course the Hobbitry in arms perhaps not dissimilar to the heavy goblin spears they're facing off against, in the sense that they're a very basic unit of spears propped up a bit more by their armour-piercing attacks, though I would suggest the heavy goblin spears are a little bit more useful all round. The hobbits, they're an awkward faction to fight, but their entry-level infantry units are very much there just to make up the numbers. More of their damaging units are found elsewhere in their roster. More Dunman spearmen moving forwards as well from Rhudaur. And also some javelin supports, and I'm a little bit surprised it wasn't the Ettenmoor's troll hunters right from the off instead of the Coldfell maidens. The troll hunters here will be a little bit better at dealing with enemy pressure with their higher numbers and also their armour. It's not the best angle they have, however. The bandits, on the other hand, do have a particularly good angle. May not be the strongest unit of javelins, but this is exactly the sort of damage that will go a long way to helping them as this battle progresses throughout the phases. Regular goblin infantry. So far the attackers very content to just send forward very low to lower mid-tier units to try and do the business. Looks like the bandits out of ammunition now, pulling out their blades. Of course they're not fantastic in melee either, but given the quality of the attacking forces that have been sent forward so far, the bandits just here to add some more numbers to the front line isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. Having a look over in the distance, Misty Mountains so far content to bide their time and wait. It is quite telling that one of the assaults is already fully underway, and it's still going to take the attackers a little bit of time over here before they can get into the correct position. Arthedain marksmen can also take their pick of units to shoot at. A couple of units of them, and you can see there are plenty of kills along the pathway. What have they been going after so far? Looks like plenty of pikes have been killed, also troll short axe throwers, so these are all really good targets actually that the Arthedain marksmen are able to pick off. The very solid anchor that is the Witch Realm pikeman, the very dangerous damage dealing potential of the troll short axe throwers being curtailed a little bit as well. So this is all good news for the attackers, but as I said, there's still a little bit of time before the attackers are going to be in a suitable position to start trying to push up this hill over here. And we have seen in the past, a few times now, a disjointed attack can often come unstuck. In the very last battle that wasn't the case. The attackers there were able to be victorious even in spite of some slightly lopsided thinking from themselves, but it will give the defenders a little bit more hope. You can see some Banderbrass archers shooting into the side as well, and Ents moving in as well as another unit of bandits, so the damage keeps coming. With the Ents moving forward, that has been enough to convince the Misty Mountains to send forward some slightly stronger units as well. However, the Black Uruks will do slightly better against monstrous infantry units like the Ents. Ettenmoor's troll hunters taking a lot of hits there. Banderbrass archers continuing to do their thing. Slightly more damaging basic archer the hobbits have. There's also the clear projectiles of the Dunedain Rangers being used. This is fairly early for the Dunedain Rangers, but it's a decent blob of units, this. And it will cause this attack to stutter once again. There's not really any danger of them making too much progress so far. Some dismounted Fornost Rhine Knights and Farmers of Buckland moving forward, one of the better units of Hobbit infantry. Various shock infantry, heavy swordsmen, and also an armour-piercing one. So, along with those javelins, the defenders will be very happy about how this engagement has gone so far. And further back we have, again, the Ettenmoor's troll hunters are still there. Heavy goblin crossbows are up on the high ground. They could start shooting, but Banderbrass archers, bandits, the only things that would be in range. Maybe they could just about reach these dismounted Fornost knights. Utilisation of the crossbows is going to be very key for the attackers here, you feel. When they decide to use them, the defenders will start to feel the pressure, but for the time being, they can remain fairly comfy. Still arrow fire coming in. I mean, there are the Witch Realm enslavers on the front line as well, so it's not as if any longer it's just a load of trash on the front line from the attackers. We are now starting to see upper mid-tier units as well as the very highest tier of bodyguards that the attackers have, but still progress is going to remain limited. And the close range support still very much in favour of the defenders. Proud protectors firing away and going after this unit of troll hunters that have made their way closer to the front line, blunting the amount of damage they can do. Going to be very important. More Menhiriath spears moving forward as well, just to make sure there's enough numbers on the front line to maintain, and given the quality that the attackers now have here, the defenders can't afford to take anything for granted. Meanwhile, this is a little bit concerning for the defenders. The Drake Broodlings managing to bulldoze through the single unit of hobbits that the defenders have decided to leave here, and this was always being far too stingy in my opinion. Leaving a single unit of light hobbit spears to guard the cliffside path when you know the Misty Mountains are on the way. But now with the Drake Broodlings here, again they're a unit which if you can keep them moving, momentum is kind of everything with them. They will uncover surely the Banderbrass archers that are over here. It's going to be bad news for them. I don't know if the Banderbrass archers over here still have ammunition or not. But the Drakes are going to... I thought they were just going to keep moving for a second then, but no. They're going to go right down this line. This is not really what they need, especially as the pressure is starting to crank up on the front line over here. It's gone quite well for the defenders so far, but one decisive action is all it takes for the attackers to suddenly have the edge, and the announcer not fancying the defenders' chances is one such example of that. The Drakes need to be fairly careful about going into the Proudfoots, I think, because I do think they count as cavalry, and that being the case, the Proudfoot protectors will make very short work of them in melee. Yeah, and you can see how quickly they're dying there. Pikes are not necessarily the best anti-cavalry unit because they don't really have the mobility to be able to respond to cavalry, but in this sort of situation where things are quite constricted, in terms of actual damage, they are of course the best at dealing with cavalry. I mean, they're being an annoyance here, the Drake Broodlings, but they're maybe not being quite as brutally effective as they could be. But a large part of that is down to the fact that there is quite a lot of anti-cavalry over here, bandits making their way to the front line as well. The quality's starting to have an impact, as it looks as though the attackers' victory seems certain for them. There was the streaking of artillery in the distance there as the trebuchet starts to fire, but not quite yet ready to start committing themselves to melee, instead opening up with a little bit of skirmishing from the Dunman Hunters. Just in behind we've got a couple of units of those trolls, the Gundabad Guard waiting as well, Guardians of Cardolan, to all of the heavier Angmar units, but they're still very spread out here, the attackers, which is a little bit concerning for me. You need to have your units ready to roll and consistently moving forwards. Maybe Rhudaur wanting to keep the Witchers moving forward. It's an early committal of the Witchers, but it is also enough to do some pretty grievous damage to that front line. Men-at-Arms, Wards of Tir and Gorthad. These are the kind of losses that the defenders can't really afford to be taking, given the discrepancy in manpower between the two sides as it was. Will they go for another volley? They will. No real response is forthcoming here either from the defenders. I mean, it could have been a lot worse actually. Several of those shots actually went short, but this is still... Is there anything that can be done about this at this stage? Probably not, but I don't know. I don't know if this is the sort of thing that defenders can afford to be withstanding in a 5v3. That's most of the Witcher's ammo gone though, and it's not quite as devastating as it could have been, as I mentioned, so we'll have to see. The result of the battle at the end is really the thing which is going to decide that. More Hobbitry and arms are on the front line now. Much of the human support that the Hobbits were getting, however, is now gone. There's still a few Fornos Knights, though they're routing, fighting to the death. And Menhiriath spears, so the presence of the Witchhelm enslavers on the front line has clearly made a big difference. The huge damage they deal with their tridents, armour piercing as well. I mean, the Ents coming in now, that's a bold move, because in theory the enslavers are one of the better units for dealing with the Ents too, but they are very bloodied at this point. Only 12 of them, I should say, remain. Another full unit of the upgraded Goblin Infantry. Goblins versus Hobbits. Name a more iconic duel. Black Uruks on the way forwards as well. Heavy Goblin Archers. Battling Brandybucks too, so I mean armour piercing is not in short supply, but with stuff like Black Uruks moving to the front line as well, I'm really not sure about the ability of the Hobbits alone to be able to hold on to this line. They will still need the occasional support from their allies, something like the Arthedain men-at-arms may do for the time being. Get a little bit more solid. The Western Kingdom's armour, exactly the sort of thing which will help prop up the more numbers-focused, armour-piercing infantry approach that the Hobbits do traffic in. The Goblin infantry are broken and fighting to the death, so that's exactly the sort of thing which will be helpful. Of course, the Black Uruk's presence on the front line as well. Another unit which should, in theory, do quite well against the Ents, so as time goes on, I'm sure that the Ents will start to fall away, though their use so far from the defenders has been pretty decent, and they definitely have managed to salvage this front line once again. Just having a look on the mini-map here, it does look as though the Misty Mountains are about to move forward, and again, still trying to get away with just this one unit of Hobbitry and arms on the front. Heavy Goblin Infantry are moving forward. One unit of them isn't so bad, but with crossbow support, with Snaga in particular, I know there's that unit of Cave Trolls as well. All of that put together, and this one unit of Hobbits is not going to suffice, though it will against a single unit of infantry like this. Execution is going to be everything here from Ricky Beagle's Goblins. Will he be successful in his endeavours? Heavy Goblin crossbows trying to squeeze around the flank, but that will expose them somewhat. What do we have here? Well, we do have the opening melee engagements over here, a combination of Barrow Wights and the heavily armoured Trolls from Angmar, reinforcing this front line after the burning at the hands of the Witchers, a unit of Dunedain Peacekeepers. To be fair, the Peacekeepers are actually probably one of the better things to bring to bear against the Barrow Wights, along with pikes. It will still take a while to carve through them, but one of the better things to be done. Another unit of pikes thinking about moving in, but need a little bit more in the way of damage dealing first. These Trolls need to be stopped. Peacekeepers have got the base damage necessary, certainly not the worst kind of unit you could send against them. I would still suggest, yeah, some dismounted Fornos Knights would be even better. Mercenary Guildsmen have got armour piercing as well, so I mean, just in terms of sheer numbers, they're doing a reasonable job, but the Trolls managing to get in behind enemy lines, going after some of the Arthedain marksmen. So a bit of a violent affair already. The Blackwatch Legion, maybe not an ideal time for them, as soon as defending reinforcements are arriving and the front line is starting to look a little bit bulkier. I don't necessarily know if the Blackwatch Legion are going to be able to make the kind of progress the attackers would want to be seeing. Here they are nonetheless. Yeah, I don't think they're really going to be able to get all the way through. There's also the small matter of all of those ranged units. Men-at-arms, Romain Gatekeepers. I saw the clear projectiles from the Arthedainian Dunedain Rangers as well. So there's going to be a lot of damage heading into that blob, and they're going to need to continue to send units forward here, the attacks, in order to sustain this attack, and this is where the somewhat stretched out nature of their reinforcements may start to bite them. Asimbor's Troll Hunters are moving forward, another unit of Guardians of Khan Doom. I mean, it is becoming a little bit chaotic, and this is largely because the Trolls have been able to bully their way in behind enemy lines. And it's not as if the defenders were trying to get away with a limited amount of units on their front line there. There was just a small gap which the Trolls were able to take more of an advantage of. Goes to show that when Angmar come forward in full force, they are very difficult to stop when they've got all of the tools at their disposal, though the Blackwatch Legion have been pretty much entirely dealt with. So while the Trolls were able to get in behind enemy lines, the Great Shield Infantry was not able to compromise the structure of this defensive line as much as they would have liked. That could prove to be an important factor going forwards as well. Mercenary Guildsmen still steady. A real rarity. Tharbad Warhammers as well. Thieves of Tharbad, Dismounted Knights of Annuminus as well. I mean, there is going to be an upper limit on what these trolls are capable of doing, especially as they go further back, and stuff like Hearthguard of Amon Sul and Thieves of Tharbad are ranged units, of course, but more than capable of looking after themselves in melee, and the trolls will probably start to struggle. There's also the small matter of troll slayers. Ooh, friendly fire. Big amount of friendly fire there. This isn't really a good angle for the artillery, I've got to be honest, because you've got to go almost through your own men to hit the enemies in the first place. They have managed to rout some of the lesser attacking units on this front line, but you've got to be very, very careful when you're using your artillery in this way. If it was coming in from the side, it would be perfect, but as it is, I would really not recommend doing that again. Artillery is always a little bit of a gamble, but there are certainly ways that you can end up shooting yourself in the foot. And the defenders may very well do that if they continue to fire from that particular position. Meanwhile, some Proudfoot Protectors and the Banderbrass Archers, both just as good, if not better, than many of the outright infantry units the Hobbits have, and now the ones taking responsibility for the front line. Rhudaur clansmen on the front, some heavy goblin infantry as well. In terms of sheer numbers, it's actually fairly even. The armour piercing that stuff like the Banderbrass Archers have is maybe not quite as effective as the Hobbits would like it to be. I guess it's kind of unfortunate that Rhudaur are one of the more domineering presences on this part of the battlefield, but still. Meanwhile, what is occurring over here? More reinforcements have been sent over here to help, but yeah, the mercenary guildsmen, and unsurprisingly, as soon as the cave trolls arrived, that's where the ante was upped, and unfortunately for them as well, the only infantry unit they've got here are pikes, and trolls tend to do very, very well against pikes. Needs must, I suppose, but this is not an ideal situation here for the defenders, and I'm kind of surprised. I mean, it's not as if this was like a sneak attack or anything like that. They had a unit of hobbits over here initially specifically because there was an enemy force coming this way. So the fact that things have developed in the way that it has, I don't know, it's bizarre for me. I don't quite know what they were expecting, but yeah. Snaga and crossbows as well, so some really good supporting units. I guess the upshot of all of this is, however, that all of the goblins that were fighting alongside the trolls have been dealt with, so this isn't an attack that's going to go anywhere long term, but they will have picked up more kills than they were expecting to, I think, here, the attackers, and that's the sort of thing which should add up in the long run for the defenders. Time and time again we've seen armies of 5 beat armies of 3 purely because of their extra numbers. Oof. All of those projectiles perfectly hitting that one troll there, and I think, yeah, that is the last of the trolls, so they caused a lot of havoc, but you can actually see there's not a huge amount of dead bodies. So while they were able to upset the balance of the defence for a while, it wasn't a permanent thing, and now this front line is still very much set. The ability to mass push from the attackers is now significantly reduced with the loss of the Blackwatch Legion and Angmar's trolls. Essenmore's troll hunters, I mean, range support from Rhudaur still could be very useful. Meanwhile, the Bjornings in behind enemy lines and causing an awful lot of trouble. It's rare that we see cavalry in the mid-game be able to escape into enemy forces and be used this effectively, but if the Bjornings can keep this up, this is another solid performance from a unit from the defenders, and this is the sort of thing which may very well add up come the end of the battle for Rodram Javelins. Attacking artillery, trying to go after the trebuchet, getting a decent hit on Minhiriath archers there. Arthedain pikemen as well, all of the range support still there. There's only 8 catapult crewmen left for the attackers, yet still they stand. Minhiriath spearmen pushing back now, farmers of Buckland, so yeah, with the loss of the trolls completely. Snaga skirmishers, the crossbows are running. Which, if they still have ammunition, they should absolutely reposition themselves to support one of the other attacks, rather than simply waiting for the defenders to come and deal with them in melee, which they would, of course. Further back. Could send some farmers of Buckland over there, I suppose. Meanwhile, the fight that has been going on over here, a little bit of progress now being made by the attackers. The initial front line has been dealt with and things have shifted backwards a little bit more. Another unit of Proudfoot protectors in melee. Some battered and bruised Rhudaur clansmen and swordsmen, probably not the answer, but with a little bit of help from the Ettenmoor's troll hunters, maybe it can be. Farmers of Buckland, surprisingly savage unit as well. Proudfoot protectors trying to flee from the heavy goblins so that they can be used more effectively later on. There are better defensive positions further back on the map after all, and perhaps the hobbits are thinking they've achieved all that reasonably can be achieved here, and it's not been a bad stand for them. They've been able to do a fair amount of damage, stuff like the Banderbrass archers and the bandits being used pretty well. And how well ranged units are used can often be the difference between victory and defeat. Pushing forward now, Goblin King's bodyguard at the centre of their efforts, as well as being anchored in place by some halberds. Routing Menhiriath spearmen. So I think what we're probably going to start to see now, also on the other side, even though the front line over there is looking pretty solid, they will be thinking about retreating at this stage. Otherwise, the domino effect could start to happen once more, where the attackers can push down here and start heading towards the front line, start trying to surround forces, one of the attacking generals, I should say. Yeah, you can see that some units are starting to be retreated now. Retreated in stages, although to be fair, I must say, it's looking like outright victory over here for the defenders, which is a great sign for them moving forward. And a huge part of that is the Bjornings. Them being able to get in behind enemy lines and start hammer and anvil charging the attacking forces has clearly wrought havoc, both in terms of outright damage and the morale damage they've been able to do. And now they're going after the Arthedain Rangers, and they'll surely be able to finish them off. This is huge. This may be enough, actually, to give the defenders the impetus they need to go on to win the battle as a whole. There may still be attacking units around here somewhere. Stuff like Trollshaw Axe Throwers being hidden. Rhudaur do have options of units that can hide. Scourge Raiders, for example, from Angmar as well. Somewhere in the lower settlement, but whatever is there is likely to be very limited. Dealing with attacking rangers as well deprives them of yet another very dangerous tool. We will turn around and go after them once more. And this monstrous cavalry being used to very good effect. It's quite telling as well that there's still mercenary guildsmen feeling good about life on a front line that was that large and that violent. What have we got here? Farmers of Buckland moving backwards. Heavy goblin crossbows have returned to this section of the field, doing their best to be a nuisance. And they are firing into the side of a line of Arthedain pikemen, ready to receive the enemy. Long streaking shots from the catapult still. From an attacking point of view, I think, based on the fact that Bjornings have been down there and could have finished the catapult off, based on the fact they were clearly getting hit by some sort of archer and weren't finished off, any kills that the attackers can get with the catapult should be considered a bit of a bonus for them, because by all rights the defenders probably should have finished them off with something, certainly with the Bjornings, not necessarily dumping more ammunition into something like that. A lot of these units very, very depleted at this point, but they'll still be very happy with their day's work on that choke point. Wards of Tir Gorthad right from the point where the Witchers were trying to grill them, succeeding in grilling them as well. What have we here? Heavy Goblin crossbows being engaged by a unit of Menhiriath spearmen, and now the axe-wielding Bjornings, who have been, I think, far and away the most impressive single unit on the field. As soon as they get a nice charge into these heavy goblin crossbows, they will surely rout. Only wavering? No, there they go. the expected result. They did at least manage to kill off one more Bjorning, however, and they've been such a pain for the attackers at this point that they'll be hoping to get rid of those bears. And Hiriath also have been fairly dependable in this battle. We haven't really seen any of the morale problems that Cardolan are known for rear their ugly heads. Still a fair amount of units over here though, and of course this needs to be the force that ultimately goes on to win the battle for the attackers, the Misty Mountains and Rhudaur, Medexa and Ricky Beagle's armies. Seraphim as well, some of his units, still a decent force over here. The attackers do still have those numbers at their disposal, and stuff like the Trollshaw Axe Throwers and Heavy Goblin Crossbows will still be capable of doing the kind of damage quickly that will be needed to make up for the losses that were sustained over here. Goblin Band revealing themselves. Anything else? Doesn't really look like it. Dunedain Captains. Another useful unit to have. As the attackers start to move forward. And yeah, trying to come forward with Heavy Goblin Crossbows would immediately expose to the Arthedain marksmen that are up here on the cliff, and the crossbows will always be a worthy target to try and shoot down. Snow Trolls on the way over. They will be enough to finish off those Minhiriath Spearmen. And again, may have been just over 20 Minhiriath Spears, but these are the sorts of losses that can be very, very telling as the battle goes on. Heavy Gobbo Crossbows. Of course, crossbows not only to preserve the attackers here. We haven't really seen, I'm sure there has been, especially on this front line over here, but we haven't really seen direct examples of the defending crossbows getting used. Heavy Goblin Archers moving forward as well, so trying to open with a little bit of skirmishing, but I mean, just having a look at the situation they're facing with the units that much higher up than them, it's going to be difficult for them to really make too much of an impression here. Dunedain Rangers. We have the Goblin Band moving forward. The one unit of infantry that Angmar still have left to them. Managing to finish off again some stragglers that weren't retreated. If the battle does come down to the difference of 30 or so infantry units in favour of the attackers, the loss of these peacekeepers and those Minhiriath spears may prove to be important. I mean, we've seen finer margins of victory than that. Everything makes a small difference after all. I hope for the defenders' sake that that isn't the case. Further back. Still some Dunedain Rangers here as well. I don't know, they've got their swords out, so I imagine that they don't really have any ammunition left. Those Heavy Goblin Spears are actually wavering as well, so they may rout. They've become a little bit more encouraged actually at the sight of a smaller unit of Dunedain Rangers. Hopping between shaken and wavering fairly consistently here. Victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. Snow Trolls on the way. That will be enough to back the Heavy Goblin Spears up and ensure they don't rout. Not a huge amount of damage being done here by the Rangers in melee either. I mean, that's to be expected, I suppose. I don't know what their melee stats are going to be changed, or if they're going to be changed at all, really, in the upcoming new patch, but their melee defense has always been pretty good, so they're capable of defending themselves in melee and keeping themselves alive. It makes them a surprisingly good addition to a front line, actually, when all is said and done. Drake Broodlings over here, Ferodrum Javelins revealing themselves as well, so more of an attacking presence over here. Again, rearing their ugly heads, moving back a little bit further. The defenders trying to make sure they're in the best possible place to make their stand. The second unit of Coldfell Maidens, first unit of which decimated very, very early on in this fight. But having these javelins, I mean, this is the sort of unit which would have been very useful on the other side of the battlefield to try and meet the challenge of those Bjornings. So far, little things like that, positionally, have worked out for the defenders. Coldfells firing in, doing damage to this front line. Mercenary guilds and what very little remains of the Warns of Tir and Gorthad facing the wrong way. The Numinous Gate Guards as well. They are going to break ranks, interestingly enough, the mercenaries. Move forward a little bit, try and maybe chase them off. It's all well and good, but if you go too far with them, they're going to get too far away from their support, and mercenaries, especially from Cardolan, are going to be far more easily convinced to rout. Still no sign that the attackers are gearing up for a massive push in the immediate future. Prodrum Javelins over there as well. Just in behind. And these Tharvad Warhammers have both seen combat to greater and lesser extents, but that armor-piercing damage will still be extremely potent. There's not a huge amount left from the Shire from what we can see, but then a lot of their units can hide, so that is worth bearing in mind, but maybe they have been the ones to suffer more than their allies here. The attackers are at their strongest through the position that it was largely the hobbits guarding. We are marching ever closer towards the final 10k frames, very often the marker of where the final phases of the battle are about to begin, and really it's just going to be a case of whether the defenders can withstand an initial hammer blow from the attackers here. Infantry wise, they still have a lot at their disposal, much of it from the Misty Mountains, so morale maybe could be a bit of a problem, but also the supporting units for the attacks are going to be very, very key as well. If they can get axe throwers and javelins into position to do damage to the defenders, then I do think the overall manpower of the defenders is likely to fall over. There's not really much that can be done about that. Meanwhile, Warns of the North will now be firing into that big column. Artillery as well, hitting those units, moving down the other road. Yeah, kills, volume of kills I think is still going to be the most important thing here for the defenders. All they really need to be doing is trying to make sure that number ticks up as quickly as possible. Warns of the North. A couple of units of Warns of the North still available. Is fairly significant. One Black Uruk decides to move forward. Does actually get the first kill, considering it is Arthedain marksman that he's facing off against. How peculiar. Still javelins coming in. This unit of, well, actually it's Snaga skirmishers this time around, but javelins once again proving to be an annoyance, and again they don't need to get kills quickly here, the attackers with their supporting units just softening the defenders up for the kill. Having the desired effect so far. That Black Uruk eventually was slain. And it has been, this middle section of the battle has been largely the attackers just preparing for the big push. Everything will come down to that. Whether the Arnorians and their hobbit neighbours will be able to hold on to this settlement, or whether the goblins, the hillmen, and their Angmarim overlords are able to dislodge them. Still javelins raining down from on high. Trollshot axe throwers being in position is also a real concern. Like I did mention, this is arguably the most dangerous range support tool that the attackers still have at their disposal. You can't allow them to get into a position like this and just do as they will. Like, if needs be, you need to try and counter-attack here, the defenders. All of that good work you did on the outer choke point is going to quickly go to waste if you just allow them to get away with this. This is just as good, though. Thieves of Tharbad scything through them. If they have enough ammunition to finish them off in their entirety, then that's all well and good. If not, they're going to need to get into melee and do it the old-fashioned way, because they've already taken a lot of damage there. Meanwhile, the assault is underway. Mountain are at coast, taking up the mantle of being the vanguard, being a stronger infantry unit as well. Not only are numbers the Misty Mountains' friend here, but they also have a decent amount of quality smattered throughout their ranks, with units like this being tasked with such things. Wardens of the North. Nine Rangers. There may only be 10 of them, but I mean, if given long enough, they can still rack up a decent little kill count for themselves. Tharbads, Trebuchet. They have moved a little bit closer. The Trollshire axe throwers are reloading. They are getting engaged in melee at the very least. Rhudaur, will they be able to withstand this? Tharbad, Thieves of Tharbad and Annunoir's Gate Guards are pretty solid. Battered and bruised Rhudaur infantry may not be the best thing, but yeah, these Trollshire axe throwers trying to fire at point blank, but in melee the Thieves of Tharbad will definitely have the beating of them. Further in, armor-piercing arrows from the Wardens of the North must be going after the Goblin King's bodyguard, and that is a good choice of target indeed. Trying to get rid of all of the higher quality units that they have, and then of course the Wardens themselves in melee, along with stuff like the Dismounted Knights of Annunoir and Tharbad Warhammers. A combination of those things will be very, very effective. Dunedain Captains and Troll Slayers moving in, though initially you have to say they're not actually close enough to get into melee with the Snow Trolls. The loss of many more of these Arthedain pikemen could prove to be a real issue. Broken and fighting to the death. Still the Wardens of the North back up here, still more Troll Slayers as well, so quality isn't necessarily an issue. In here we have archers, over here more trolls, the Snow Trolls moving forward, and things are a little bit more exposed over here. The Tharbad Warhammers are moving in, but they're already a little bit more thin on the ground than the kind of support that's being given to the other side. But then again, the infantry support that the Trolls had over here was also more meagre, so as a result they can get away with having a little bit less perhaps on this front line. The main avenue of assault for the attackers would appear to be this hill. Trolls are making progress, but the more progress they make, of course, the more they're going to encounter the units that are far more capable of killing them off. Troll Slayers mainly, and also the Dunedain Captains with that base damage. Snow Trolls are less armour focused than the heavy Angmar Trolls we saw bludgeon their way through the front lines earlier. Proud for Protector's still alive, so the Hobbits may well have been the defending faction to suffer the most in the initial stages of the battle. But they're still here, and a unit of Proudfoots, the one that we saw escape the front line as well, I'm sure, showing why they were retreated here. There's a lot of armour-piercing projectiles that the defenders still have. 2 units of Wardens of the North, a few units of crossbows from both the Hobbits and from Cardolan. I don't think they have any Rangers left, but the Rangers will have already been, well, we saw them be effective over there and also on the other side actually, so You can't complain too much about such things, and then the quality they have in melee is what they will be hoping, I'm sure, to see them over the line. Minotaur Roman Gatekeeper's not the worst unit to have in melee at this late stage either. Armour piercing, and a phalanx to be utilised. Trollshaw axe throwers. Still, I would suggest, one of the more dangerous units that can be used here, and they've got plenty of good targets they can go after. Another volley of throwing axes there, and a healthy unit of black Uruks on their way forwards as well. You can see in here as well some out of ammunition Minhiria sharpshooters. Now engaged in their second job as an armour-piercing line infantry unit. Won't go completely to waste against this kind of Misty Mountains unit, that's for sure. Sharpshooters, how much progress is being made by the attackers over here? You'd have to say not much. In fact, the defenders are starting to push them back down the hill. Cave Trolls on their way forwards now, but once again, main issue here is going to be the continuing presence of the Dunedain captains, and especially those Troll Slayers. Cave Trolls even more fragile than the Snow Trolls, which have already been dealt with. Mountain Uruk host routing the Goblin King's bodyguard are here, even having taken a little bit of damage from the Wardens of the North on the approach. They're still a strong line infantry unit that will have to be dealt with, but they can be held at arm's length by plentiful pikes, and that's probably what's going to be happening here. Arthedain pikes and Proudfoot protectors, a very solid defensive infantry unit as well in the Hearthguard of Amon Sul, who presumably have used up their ammunition. Hard nut to crack. Will the attackers have the units necessary to be able to kill off something that's as defensively savvy as that? And now the Goblin King's bodyguard still taking hits in the back from Wardens of the North. So things are actually looking pretty good for the defenders here, you'd have to say. Further down the hill. Still got reinforcements, but that's pretty much it, I think. Still got some Blackback Berserkers and White Uruk Fearmongers, so good quality here and there, but are they going to deploy it at the right time, or are they going to wait too long here, the attackers? Because I think maybe some hyper-aggression here would be the sort of thing to unsettle the defenders, and maybe that would be enough. As it is, though, Dunedain Rangers still firing away. But the Dunedain Rangers almost completely wiped out by a single volley from the Trollshaws, and hate to be the prophet bearing bad news, but the Trollshaw axe throwers so far have definitely shown why I've been constantly hammering on about them in this battle. Axe throwers in general, so effective in this version of the game. Heavy Goblin Halberds moving forward as well to try and help anchor the attacking force in place. Still a unit of Tharbad Warhammers in reserve. Don't know what's up with the Trebuchet. Ones of the North getting hit by those throwing axes as well. There really is no waiting for later at this point in time for the defenders. I don't really know why the Ones of the North are going way back over there. You may as well get them into the front line. Get them doing something more useful. Another unit of Wardens, and there's still Troll Slayers at the top of the hill as well. Outright victory is still going to be going towards the defenders over here though, especially since the arrival of the Hearthguard. Forward come the White Uruk Fearmongers, immediately attracting the attention of the Wardens of the North, as well they should. White Uruk Fearmongers are not the sort of thing that you want to be seeing able to bully your infantry units in the late game. So cutting them down to size a little bit before they make it to the front line will be very, very good for them. Hearthguard of Amon Sul now moving probably to the other side, their presence not needed over here any longer, only one cave troll remains. There's still some Troll Slayers in here which should be able to deal with him in fairly short order. Fearmongers, Ricky Beagle and Seraphim need to be assisting one another and moving as one entity a little bit more so than they are. If they do that, then they should be able to make something happen. More reinforcements are needed though, with Snow Trolls on the way forward. A whole unit of Dunman Pikemen as well. There's also the small matter of the Ferodrum Javelins, which are very, very deadly in terms of their projectiles and their melee abilities, especially at this late stage. Snow trolls right in and amongst things over here, trying to go after the trebuchet crew. Portolano's Dunedain troll slayers in a really good position actually to start firing javelins into this blob. Could be enough to cause a lot of these units to rout, which may be a big difference maker. Ones in the north do now decide to move forward, so better late than never. They are now on the front line and their presence will definitely help things. Routing these units, however, is a possibility, like I said. Lots of these units more susceptible to that sort of thing. Troll slayers, though, dawdling too much. And as a result, the Reforged javelins able to get some counter skirmishing into them. The trolls, once again, they have been a really disruptive element in this battle as a whole, the trolls. Every time we've seen them move forward, they've been used, maybe not in terms of damage dealing as domineering as we've seen them in the past, but the way they've been utilised has definitely caused chaos. Can't ask for too much than that in this kind of situation, I think. Whiter at Fearmongers, it says victory seems certain for them. Though I think as this battle wears on, the superior range of the various pikes from the defenders will actually make that tick the other way. And there goes the Hobbit General. Small matter of the Arthedain Berserkers as well. The attackers had more quality still left to them late on here than I was thinking they did. A few volleys from the Arthedain Berserkers will make life extremely uncomfortable for them. Inheriath Archers, Blackback Berserkers, 2 units of them by the looks of it. 2 units of Blackback Berserkers are difficult to bring down. Unit of Reforged Javelins, Arthedain Berserkers. Hearthguard of Amon-Sul need to stay over here. There's no retreating from this front line if you want it to remain standing. The trebuchet almost certainly still has ammunition, but the time has come to use it. The time has come to hit that panic button. Maybe go after the Reforged Javelins, and even if the shot goes short, it's probably going to end up hitting enemy units. You can end up routing a lot of the lower tier units that they have around these units. Dunedain Troll Slayers are fighting. They've been engaged in melee, but not the worst thing necessarily. And there we go. Good hit from the trebuchet right into the Reforged Javelins. Will this make the difference? Ones in the north moving back in as well. Still 86 Reforged Javelins and 62, 2 units of them. The quality they've managed to maintain until the late game here is very impressive here, the attackers. It's one of those situations in a 5v3 where you're not quite sure where they've managed to conjure up all of these units from. They just have a tendency to just keep dipping into those reserves, and I think that's probably what's going to make the difference here, as much as I think the defenders have actually played really quite well. I just think there's not enough. Not enough of the defenders that remain. Routing is maybe still a bit of an issue. You can see that several of these units, 117 Heavy Goblin Halberds routing is not the sort of sight that the attackers want to be seeing, really. Snaga, Reforged Javelins, plenty of supporting units still here, throwing projectiles en masse. Another hit from the trebuchet, and even bodyguard units like the Reforged Javelins are going to start thinking about routing when they're taking consistent artillery fire. Many bodyguard units simply have very high morale after all. They don't necessarily have locked morale. It's a rarer trait than you might think. Forward momentum over here still for the goblins. Blackback Mountain Berserkers. 61 still remain. Arthedain Berserkers on the way forward. Still the Coldfell Maidens will be able to come forward and start throwing javelins when the time is right. There goes a Misty Mountain General. Potentially key, that. That might be enough to convince a lot of the basic goblins over here to begin routing. Though, to be fair, I think with Rhudaur being the main presence over here now, as long as even the White Uruks are actually routing, which is a surprise, As long as the blackbacks stay fighting alongside the forces from Rhudaur, I don't think the attackers will mind too much. Ferocious javelins in behind enemy lines, Coldfell Maidens starting to make a little bit of a mess of proceedings as well. Chaos descends, and it looks as though that defensive line was just overcome. Maybe, again, peeling those Wards of the North and Hearthguard of Amon-Sul off the front line, I think may prove to be a key mistake there. Yes, this front line over here was failing, but in so doing you've sealed the fate of one of your other front lines anyway, so you haven't really gained anything. In fact, you may have lost both front lines as a result of that, which has now turned into a bit of indecision because these units have had to return anyway. A lot of units there. Heavy Goblin Halberds are running, as are the Dunman Pikemen. All is not lost yet for the defenders, given the amount of routing that is going on. Cardolan, for once, showing themselves to be far more mentally resilient than the foes they're facing. Ones of the North are going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting, but there goes a defending general. That was Arthedain's, I believe. Hearthguard of Amon-Sul doing their best over here. Notice how Roman gatekeepers can help hunt down the Coldfell Maidens. Ferocious javelins bloodied and battered, given their rough treatment at the hands of that trebuchet. Coldfell Maidens being used as makeshift shock cavalry, not the ideal unit, nor the ideal position and terrain to be used as such, but giving the defenders a taste of their own medicine after the very good performance of the Bjornings earlier on. Somewhat even fight actually, but the Snaga, trebuchet crew, having to deal with Pranodyne Berserkers. I mean, they may very well end up winning on the other front line very narrowly, the defenders, but they're going to get beaten over here by the White Uruks, by the Blackbacks. This one Ranger still remains, trying to get as many kills as possible before the inevitable happens. Looks like we're going to see another attacker victory here. One by one. DPS value is very low, but still. And yeah, fair play to the attackers. They've managed to maintain enough of their strength late on, even in spite of the damage they were taking. Especially over here. The defenders did a very good job over here. Bjornings behind enemy lines, good defensive position. Ranged units clearly doing a lot of damage. But in the end, not quite enough. And I thought initially as well the Hobbits were doing reasonably, but I guess it just goes to show that reasonable is not good enough in a 5v3 if you're defenders. You need to be exceptional and near faultless. And the attackers also need to make some pretty serious missteps in order for you to be able to go on to win a battle. Positioning is also very key, though I don't think there was much else positionally. The defenders could have done much better on a map like this. And we have seen defenders be victorious on this map before, taking up similar positions, not exactly the same perhaps, but similar. But there we have it. As far as the margin of victory, yeah, 5%. 5% I think was exactly the same as what we saw in the very last battle as well, during the defence of Lest. That doesn't strike me as too peculiar, given what we have left. It looks like a fairly decent amount this, but then a very numbers heavy attacking force was what we saw today. Have they indeed? Well, there we have it. May as well go up to ×2 speed actually. And another battle reaches its conclusion in favour of the attackers once more. Though once again a competitive one. And not much. It's all about small margins as well. Time and time again actually in battles that I've been showcasing recently, we've seen that the differences that the losing side could have made, it's more small tweaks than like large sweeping things. The Hobbit's actually getting the most amount of kills, which is kind of surprising, given the amount of units that were over there. I mean, The Bjornings must have got a lot of kills, the ranged units as well. I mean, the Hobbits were a ranged focused faction perhaps, and that's the key. As far as the attackers go, Y2K and TS Niehoff were the ones that suffered at the hands of the front line that was mainly comprised of the two Arnorian petty kingdoms. So yeah, a weird fight this. In terms of kills, in terms of what we saw, there's a lot to unpack potentially from it, but let's see what did the damage for Arthedain, who actually got the fewest kills from his team. But Dunedain Rangers, 726, so that's a highly acceptable amount of kills from a unit of Rangers in a battle like this. Wardens of the North doing decently as well. 250 is more the kind of number you want to see than 150, but if those 150 are all upper end units, which you'd want them to be from armor-piercing archers, then it's more acceptable. Troll Slayers may be less impressive than you would want them to be, though they were going up against their namesake, Trolls, so maybe again that's okay. Arthedain Marksman did okay. A lot of the basic infantry, though, is where things maybe could have been a little bit better. Peacekeepers need to be seeing more, need to be getting 100 plus on them at least, especially given the numbers heavy nature of the attacking armies here. Pikes held the line reasonably enough, but if they're holding the line for long enough, they should be getting more kills than that. Numinous Gate Guards, much the same sort of thing. Dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights, again kind of disappointing for such a damage-heavy unit. All of the Arthedain infantry not really up to the task, so I think the ranged units from the defenders did the job here, but in melee, maybe a little bit too much of the rank and file, a little bit too much of the regular, and it wasn't enough to deal with the overwhelming horde that they were faced with. But still, big thank you to Portaleno for sending this one to me. Big thanks to all of the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. This is a map we've seen several times at this point. It's one of those which does seem to make its regular appearance, and for understandable reasons. It's a reasonably big settlement that's pretty well designed and actually set up quite well for large scale sieges like this. It's not too big, but also not too small, so just right. Anyway, as far as what's going to be coming up next, I do have another map that's kind of in regular rotation in the Cardolan Outpost, which will be the very next battle that we see, and that will also be the last battle that I'm able to record before I go away on my 3-week trip, though. I will say that at this point I'm recording 2 months ahead of schedule, so this is all kind of by the by really as far as you watching it goes, because I'm talking to you from way back in March, and by the time this one comes out I believe it will be May. Getting into a fair ways into May, I think. So that is the situation as it stands. That one battle replay, and then there's a couple of others as well, which I will be doing once I get back. Sort of trying to schedule those, and by the time I get back as well, hopefully we will be staring down the barrel of the new patch being a little bit more imminent than it has been for a while now. And of course, as that goes on, as I've mentioned before, there will be a little bit of crossover where I will still be showing off stuff from this version of the game and also mixed with some of the stuff from the new patch as well. So there will be a crossover period where the old patch is still making regular appearances on the channel, but that will start to peter out, I'm sure, as soon as the new patch is released and as we go further on into the year. But yeah, pretty much as you were, and there's still the looming spectre of a channel update or some sort of channel announcement that I will have to make at some point during the summer, I believe. But yes, enough of my waffling. Big thanks to all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.